Across both East and West, the origins of many martial arts lie in practical techniques developed for the battlefield, skills premised on the exchange of life and death. In Japan, while an aesthetic ideal known as Bushido did exist, arts such as Kenjutsu, Kyujutsu, and Jujutsu were all combat systems refined for survival under extreme conditions. In martial arts, the ultimate criterion of value was beyond question whether one could actually fight. Kanō Jigorō did not view Jujutsu merely as a form of combat. Instead, he reconstructed it as a comprehensive system designed to foster human development through martial practice, crystallizing this vision into a new concept he called Judo. In 1919, following Kano's ideas, the Dai Nippon Butokukai reclassified all bujutsu under the collective term budō. Kenjutsu became kendo, Kyujutsu became kyudo, and Jujutsu became judo. Martial practice was thus redefined from a system of techniques into a way aimed at character formation. However, the social climate from the Meiji through the Showa periods, defined by the national policy of Fukoku Kyohei, enrich the country, strengthen the military, did not faithfully inherit Kano's ideals. The martial arts world gradually drifted toward an excessive emphasis on mental toughness, giving rise to a culture of uncritical spiritualism and grit-based training. What Kano envisioned was a path that sought the perfection of the individual through martial practice as a medium. However, under the militaristic climate of the time, Budō came to function as an instrument of national integration that reinforced Kokutai ideology, a value system that placed the emperor at the center of the state, fused nation and people into a single entity, and prioritized the public over the individual. As a result, it came to be believed that sheer volume of training outweighed quality. Drinking water was seen as weakness, rest as laziness, or as a sign of mental frailty. Although the degree varied from dojo to dojo, scientific perspectives on physical limits and recovery were largely disregarded, and inefficient training methods became the norm. The notion that enduring suffering in itself has value as training was accepted in a largely uncritical manner. Yet the budō envisioned by Kano was never meant to signify such irrational spiritualism. On the contrary, it was intended to be a system that rationally integrated technique, body, and mind, and elevated them toward human development. Nevertheless, the mentality of pre-war and wartime spirit-first instruction was carried over into the post-war period without sufficient examination, and under the name of budō, it continued to be followed for many years. Experientially speaking, it would not be inaccurate to say that this type of instructional mindset persisted strongly until around the 1980s. So what then was the original Budō philosophy of Jigoro Kano? As a clue in seeking the answer, we will examine the secrets of progress in Budō, the 12 Precepts of Judo, written by Kano himself. The principles presented there are not limited to Judo alone, but can be understood as a universal philosophy that underlies all systems that call themselves Budō. Practice of kata and randori must always be conducted with the mindset of a life and death struggle. In everyday training, it is of course necessary to take care not to injure one another, whether in kata or randori. However, when such caution becomes excessive, it instead gives rise to complacency. If that complacency becomes habitual, one will inevitably be defeated when confronted with a genuine lethal attack in actual combat. Therefore, while care to avoid injury is essential, it is equally indispensable to train with the mental readiness that the opponent is attacking in deadly earnest. While the mindset described above is important, it must also be understood that daily training is a means toward a future goal, not the goal itself. Victories and defeats during training are not true life and death struggles. They are merely one method for the sake of cultivation. One must not become fixated on winning and losing and thereby lose sight of the true purpose of training. Training is not confined solely to the dojo. The dojo is necessary for learning techniques and engaging in matches, but training can be carried out in every aspect of daily life. One must live at all times with the resolve to be able to respond to any form of attack. Dangerous techniques should be avoided, and training should focus on techniques suited to the goal of physical development. There are countless techniques used in judo, kata, and randori. By selecting from among them those most appropriate to the aims of physical education and combining them as needed, one can train the body in the most effective manner. Close attention must be paid to diet, sleep, and rest. To build a strong and healthy body, it is not enough to consider only the quantity and quality of food. Careful attention, grounded in both theory and experience, must also be given to how food is consumed, as well as to sleep and rest. Training must be conducted in a disciplined and orderly manner. Physical development is governed by the principles of physiology. One does not become strong simply by exercising recklessly. Moreover, if one neglects exercise or employs incorrect methods, the body will not only fail to develop, but may instead grow weaker. Not only in the practice of kata and randori, but also in all events and things encountered in daily life, one must make a conscious effort to draw material for spiritual and mental cultivation. In randori, it is important to cultivate attentiveness and powers of observation. When studying techniques, one should develop thinking and reasoning ability. When actually applying techniques, one must cultivate sound judgment. One should assess whether one's training and self-cultivation are adequate by observing how others respond. At times, it is necessary to listen to others' opinions, pay attention to how one's practice appears to others, and engage constantly in self-reflection. One must clearly understand that the moral principles practiced throughout the ages, as well as so-called good words and good deeds, ultimately all rest upon the principle of maximum efficient use of energy and mutual welfare and benefit. Seiryoku Zenyo, Jita Kyoe. Traditional teachings sometimes contain contradictions, or may make it difficult to render clear judgments regarding specific social issues. In such cases, if one judges matters in light of the principle of maximum efficient use of energy and mutual welfare and benefit, solutions can be reached with relative ease. However, if one neglects the study and practice of this principle in everyday life, one will be unable to make correct judgments when the need arises. Therefore, one's habitual mental attitude is of paramount importance. Most teachings practiced in the world are, in essence, consistent with the teachings of judo. But because they are excessively complex and cumbersome, many are not adequately applied in daily life. All of them should be evaluated according to the principle of maximum efficient use of energy and mutual welfare and benefit. If this is done, almost all problems can be resolved immediately. The improvement of clothing, food and housing, etiquette and manners, and the cultivation of knowledge, all of these are included within this principle. If budō is understood as a path through which one grows as a human being by means of martial practice, then in what way do these 12 principles indicate a path that fosters such human development? Training must always be approached with seriousness, yet one must not become obsessed with victory, defeat, or results themselves. Effort is merely a means toward self-perfection. The moment the means become the goal, growth comes to a halt. In life as well, it is essential not to be swayed by immediate competition or evaluation, but to keep sight of one's true purpose. While approaching practice with seriousness is essential, becoming overly attached to winning, losing, or external evaluation narrows one's perspective and leads away from the true purpose of cultivation. Victory and defeat are merely provisional indicators of growth, not goals in themselves. From the standpoint of character development, this teaching fosters emotional composure unaffected by immediate results, clarity about the purpose of one's efforts, and psychological stability that neither breeds arrogance in victory nor discouragement in defeat. These qualities are indispensable not only in martial training, but also in navigating a competitive society. This teaching shows a way of thinking that does not confine training to the special space of the dojo, but instead regards everyday life itself as a place for human development, lived with the constant alertness and discipline of a warrior. While the dojo is necessary as a place to learn techniques, it points to a path of living as a martial artist at all times and in all places. Unlike judo, which is based on the premise of mutual improvement through controlled practice, classical jujutsu appears to have emphasized highly practical, combat-oriented training. While this approach produced many practitioners of exceptional technical skill, it is difficult to deny that, at a time when martial norms and safety considerations were not yet well established, such training was sustained in part by the sacrifices of numerous dojo members. Those who were injured were inevitably forced to withdraw from practice, and during that period, their technical development came to a halt. Kano's decision to remove dangerous techniques from jujutsu and to reorganize it into a systematic discipline was not merely aimed at the popularization of martial arts. Rather, by creating an environment that allowed for continuous training, his goal can be seen as raising the overall average level of strength and skill within the dojo and ultimately among practitioners as a whole, rather than producing only a few outstandingly strong individuals, while also fostering mutual growth as human beings. In the Japanese martial arts world of the time, which tended to place excessive emphasis on technique and sheer toughness, Kano's advocacy of scientific training methods, proper nutrition, and the importance of rest was a perspective uniquely his own and is particularly fascinating. Kano also translated and published works by Yugen Sando, regarded as the father of modern bodybuilding. It highlights the importance of valuing discipline, reason, and moderation rather than merely the quantity of effort. Practicing in a disciplined manner cultivates self-control, while understanding that physical development follows physiological principles, fosters rational judgment that is not swayed by mere willpower or guts. Furthermore, recognizing that neither excess nor neglect leads to growth develops a sense of balance, the ability to assess one's own condition and choose an appropriate level of effort. In this sense, this teaching can be seen as advocating an attitude aimed at becoming a mature individual who refines oneself through calm judgment and restraint. This teaching emphasizes that spiritual cultivation is not limited to designated training times, such as kata or randori. All experiences encountered in daily life, including relationships with others, successes, and failures, should be treated as material for self-cultivation. It rejects the notion that training equals a special time, and instead reframes one's entire way of living as a form of practice. It cultivates the awareness that human growth is determined not by extraordinary situations, but by how one engages with everyday life. Randori develops instantaneous attention and powers of observation. The study of techniques cultivates logical thinking and reasoning, and actual application fosters decisiveness. This structure demonstrates that martial training is not merely physical, but a systematic method for refining human cognitive capacities themselves. A mature individual is one who can appropriately distinguish and integrate sensation, reason, and judgment according to the situation. Self-cultivation cannot be measured by subjective perception alone. It must be objectively verified through the reactions and opinions of others. This teaching cautions against self-righteousness and self-absorption, and instead calls for refining oneself within human relationships. Human growth deepens not through isolated introspection, but through engagement with others. This section teaches that when ancient moral teachings and virtuous conduct are pursued to their core, they ultimately converge on the principles of Seiryoku Zenyo, maximum efficient use of energy, and Jita-kyoei, mutual welfare and benefit. Here, martial arts are positioned not as a specialized or closed value system, but as something continuous with universal ethical principles shared by humanity. Martial training is presented as a foundation for cultivating individuals who can act ethically and responsibly in society. Even when existing teachings contradict one another or fail to address real-world problems, sound judgment can be achieved by returning to the principles of Seiryoku Zenyo and Jita-kyoei. However, this capacity can only be developed through continual daily study and practice. Growth does not mean obeying memorized doctrines, but understanding principles and acquiring the ability to judge independently. Many teachings in the world are fundamentally valid, yet remain unused in everyday life because they are overly complex. By organizing them around the principles of Seiryoku Zenyo and Jita-kyoei, it is taught that most issues, from food, clothing, and shelter to etiquette and learning, can be addressed. Human fulfillment lies not in the accumulation of knowledge, but in acquiring practical wisdom that applies principles to daily living. Based on the Judo 12 precepts, I have offered my own reflections from the perspective that budō is a path of personal growth through the practice of martial skills. In the general mindset of Japanese society, combat sports and budō tend to be clearly distinguished. While parents may send their children to a dojo for the purpose of character development or learning proper etiquette, it is rare for them to enroll their children in a gym for the same reasons. A dojo is commonly understood as a place to study budō, whereas a gym is seen as a place to learn MMA, boxing, kickboxing, and other forms of what are broadly called martial arts. What makes budō truly budō lies in the philosophy and ethical principles exemplified by teachings such as the Judo 12 precepts. The reason budō practitioners have traditionally been held in a certain regard within Japanese society may be that they are perceived as individuals of character, people who embody these shared norms and values. How do you see this distinction? Beginning with the temple introduced earlier as the birthplace of the Kodokan, Tokyo and its surrounding areas are home to numerous historical sites connected to the martial arts. In addition to such locations that rarely appear in standard guidebooks, this book also features districts lined with martial arts equipment shops, as well as schedules for large-scale demonstration events of traditional Japanese martial arts, such as classical Jujutsu, Kusarigama, and Naginata, that may be unfamiliar to many readers. For martial artists planning to visit Tokyo, this book can truly be considered an essential companion.
Japan Bee is a channel that randomly shares information about lesser-known aspects of Japanese culture, spanning across various genres.